So a while back, Martymer made a response to a video by the goth artist Morgue, who, as you may be aware, has taken an interest in metaphysics and its interplay with physics. Morgue's video, in summary, was on the idea that reality is a construction of code, and that there are glitches in the physics of it that give this away. Martymer, of course, tried to debunk it. Anyway, both of these are down in the description bar if you are interested. Now, the irony in this video is that Martymer actually ended up agreeing with Morgue's central point, while at the same time, of course, pretending that he debunked Morgue. And he did all of this without even realizing it seems. Which, of course, is quite hilarious and embarrassing, but we'll get to that part where he ends up unwittingly agreeing with Morgue later. Though in fairness, in the meantime, I may have to correct Morgue on a few things along the way that Martymer did get right. Now, before we begin, let me just say that if Morgue is watching this, or if one of his fans or Hyperions is, I have a special message for you at the very end, so stay tuned for that, or skip to it if you want. But you don't want to miss it. If you're watching this, Morgue, trust me when I tell you, you will very much want to see it. Anyway, let's dive into this video. So at only 25 seconds in, Martymer is already saying something stupid. Let's take a look, shall we?
Even ones that you don't think of as physical entities in their own right, like the ones and zeros in a computer, they are electrical signals, which are physical. Electrical signals in a CPU. Or they are patterns, physical patterns in some kind of storage medium. All codes that you have any experience with, all codes that you can even imagine, are physical.
No. Sorry, but no. Well, okay, I may give you this halfway, depending on what your exact definition of what the term physical is. However, let me freeze the screen right here and explain what you got wrong. If we are in a simulation, which we'll get to later, it is definitely not a physical, if by physical you mean based on a material substrate simulation. And the reasons for this are, well, basic physics. Something called the Feynman universal simulator problem prevents our world from being simulated in any sort of fundamentally materially real world. The reason for this has to do with the existence of qubits, or quantum bits, in our own world. Qubits, of course, exploit the principle of superposition in quantum mechanics, where an object in superposition can be in many separate states at the same time. Now, this becomes a very serious problem if the world were to turn out to be a simulation, and if it were to be simulated in a classical computer. Because unlike qubits, classical bits can only have one state per bit at a time. They can only be a 1 or a 0, and not many 1s and many 0s all at the same time. So now if one were to try to simulate all the qubits in our world, inside a classical computer, one would need to unpack all the individual states in all of those qubits into individual states in the classical computer, up at the next level that would be simulating us. And this, of course, would require a computer many times larger in its universe than our universe is in ours, as whoever would have built it would need to make a hard drive big enough for all of the individual states in the qubits in our universe. And as physicist Richard Feynman noted, this would slow down processing immensely. It would be impossibly ridiculous to build. Meaning, if anyone is simulating us, and our universe contains qubits, then their universe has to contain qubits and therefore obey quantum rules as well. Now, of course, one might say it's quantum, but that doesn't mean it's immaterial. Well, I'm sorry, but if you think that, you're screwed as well. See, back in 2007, a team of scientists led by the top quantum experimentalists in the world published this little paper in Nature showing that realism, aka as in, like what applies to what you call real matter, is falsified in quantum mechanics. So if you believe that the world around you is a real material reality, and you also claim to believe in science, which includes quantum mechanics, well, you're screwed. Now, of course, you might say that the many worlds interpretation gives you an out, and that a state not being in a definite real value in our world doesn't mean it doesn't have real values in superposition that are just not in our world yet. But if you go down that route, you'll be caught off by problems to do with the preferred basis problem in MWI. The preferred basis problem is the issue of why the particles in the many worlds should be interacting in the form of a probability wave versus simply being the collective superposition of individual classical trajectories, with no one single particle engaging in wave-like behavior. Now, from what I'm told, there's a solution to this, but to cut to the chase, it turns out that this solution requires space to be an illusion, which would of course mean that material reality is also an illusion, which would cut this off as an escape route. So applying this to the simulation hypothesis, if there is anyone simulating us, their world would need to be immaterial as well, since it is also obeying quantum rules. So no, your belief that a would-be simulator would need to be immaterial has already been falsified. Anyway, let's continue with the video.
But if that's true, how come there aren't any glitches? How come you don't hit the edge of the map, so to speak?
Because a glitch is an unintended behavior. In order to speak of an unintended behavior, we need to know what the intended behavior is. And as far as we know, nature doesn't have any intended behavior. It just behaves the way it does.
Oh, come on. Yes, a glitch is technically an unintended behavior, but you know what he's getting at. What he's trying to say is if we're in a simulation, then there should be artifacts of information processing detectable in the physics of our world. It doesn't have to mean that it's literally an unintended behavior. This notion is not even Morgue's and showed up first in computer scientist Brian Whitworth's papers, showing there to be parallels between the information processing artifacts present in computer games and the physics of our own world. So let's look at Morgue's glitches, shall we?
Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Now think about how strange that is. The speed of light is at 300,000 kilometers per second no matter what.
And now to Martymer.
Once we accept that space and time are relative concepts and that the speed of light is an important part of how different frames of reference relate, this isn't a glitch, not even an apparent one. Without this limit, electromagnetic waves could not propagate through vacuum, and the universe as we know it could not exist. That makes this a feature rather than a glitch. It's just counterintuitive is all.
Yes, but why is it counterintuitive? The notion that you can't go faster than the speed of light in any inertial reference frame is a very strange thing and not something that jives with common sense at all. And when something doesn't jive with common sense, we can do one of two things. We can say either that it's just a feature that happens to be counterintuitive and stop thinking about it, or we can ask why it is counterintuitive until we can make sense of it. And despite his lack of physics training, it looks like Morgue is trying to do the latter. Nothing going faster than the speed of light in any inertial frame doesn't make any sense in a world composed of matter floating in empty space. But it does make sense if we see the world as a virtual construct with a limited processing rate. If a speed in the game tries to approach the speed of the processing rate, simulating it, the computer will slow down and you will never go faster than the speed of the processing rate. Now just treat the processing rate as the speed of light, and suddenly the speed of light limit doesn't seem so counterintuitive anymore. But this is exactly the sort of artifact you would expect in a virtual construct based on information processing, aka a glitch.
You hit a wall.
What? No, you don't. Not even if I interpret that generously as all of a sudden your velocity stops increasing in proportion to the square root of your kinetic energy. The E equals mv squared over 2 formula is just an approximation that happens to work fine for values of v that are small compared to the speed of light, c. It gradually works worse and worse, and the discrepancy between it and the correct E equals gamma mc squared minus mc squared gradually approaches infinity as v goes to c. It's not that there's a clear pattern being suddenly interrupted. The impossibility of reaching the speed of light is part of that very clear pattern.
Yes, as in an asymptote as v approaches c, aka a wall. That's not even a disagreement, it's merely a difference of semantics. Who said anything about a pattern suddenly being interrupted? Okay, moving on.
Wave-particle duality shows that everything in existence exhibits wave behavior. That means that everything, even matter, behaves like a wave.
And that's a glitch. How exactly? It's just counterintuitive once again.
See? Here you go again with taking the incurious path. Yes, of course it's counterintuitive. That's the whole point. In fact, when you look at it up close, wave-particle duality, the notion that a particle can be smeared out in a probability wave of locations at once, before only appearing in one defined location, is extremely counterintuitive. But why? Why would something like this exist in our reality in the first place? A mundane Democritean materialist world wouldn't have something like this in it. So instead of saying, yeah, it's counterintuitive, before just accepting it without further questions and moving on, why don't we question what it could be about the world that would be making it behave in such a weird counterintuitive way? Might it be that the world is in some sense a virtual construct? Could that explain why we have weird things like wave-particle duality in it? Well, considering that the phenomenon of quantum tunneling is coincidentally a necessary consequence of both wave-particle duality and virtual simulation, maybe it's because our world is also an illusory information-based construct. Heck, Philip Rosedale, one of the programmers from Second Life, actually noted the same thing.
Basically, if you leave a marble in a cup in Second Life, and you leave all night, and you come back, what happens? The marble's gone. And it actually turns out that that problem isn't fixable. If you don't want that little marble to leave the cup that it's in, you actually would have to have an infinite amount of computing power to guarantee that it won't over a certain amount of time. Does everybody sort of see where I'm going with this? So what was just incredibly interesting to me, and I was already very interested in virtual worlds, was this bizarre fact that the computational limits imposed by simulation when you were simulating a virtual world on a computer essentially resulted in the same kind of, I'm just going to say, artifacts or problems that make quantum mechanics weird.
Okay, on to number 3.
Next is the law of conservation of energy. This shows that energy can never be created or destroyed, only transformed.
Same question, how is that a glitch?
Alright, I agree there. That's actually perfectly normal and doesn't seem to require any counterintuitive information processing effects. Sorry, Morgue, but I have to give this one to Martymer. Now I'm going to skip ahead to number 5 because I want to give 4 a little more time, and at the end there is a little, or shall we say, a large surprise.
Singularities. Now, singularities exist at the very center of black holes.
Gravitational singularities are a prediction of general relativity, which is known to break down at very small scales because it doesn't take quantum mechanics into account.
Sorry, but I have to give this one to Martymer as well. Singularities only exist in our modelings of things and only appear when the model hits its limits. Once we have singularities, we need to find a new theory, and singularities would not be conducive to being information processing artifacts anyway, given the impossibility of simulating something of infinite density, such as a singularity, on a discrete information processor. Now let's switch back to number 4.
Next up is quantum entanglement, and this shows if you have two particles that are entangled, a change in one particle will instantly affect the other.
Okay, I suppose I can give partial credit here. Interpretations of quantum mechanics are a result of an apparent glitch, but it's only an apparent glitch if you ignore that the solution to the problem is that there is no problem to begin with. This interpretation of what's going on, that information is sent instantaneously, ignores both the principle of locality, violating special relativity, because information can't travel faster than the speed of light, as we've already established, and also the well-established principles of quantum mechanics in order to avoid the simplest possible conclusion. That if you treat the entire universe as a single quantum system, all that happens when one particle is measured is that two states of the entire universe that up until that point had existed in superposition decohere into separate parallel worlds. In neither world has one particle in any way affected the other. No information has been sent between them.
No, but the quantum state of the particle is changed instantaneously, even if we can't derive information from it. The collapse event occurs instantaneously at both particles, despite a measurement of only one particle at one location having taken place. The quantum state of the other particle somehow knows this, light years away, and that kind of thing doesn't make any sense if these quantum states are linked through a spatially separated material world. In other words, within a material world, such an effect might appear to be a, what was that word again? Oh yes, a glitch. However, it does make sense in a different sort of world. And we'll now let physicist George Musser explain exactly what that sort of world is.
But now I think the progress of science and of understanding of the nature of space and time have taken us to a possible explanation. So if you think of those two coins, they're on opposite sides of the universe or their continent or wherever they may be, but they act as though they're right next to one another. They act as though they're kind of nuzzled up together. So they don't seem to have any distance between them. They're acting as though there's no distance between them, although you go measure the distance, it's enormous. So the proposition is that the distance between them is somehow an illusion. It's somehow a kind of a mirage. Or maybe a better way of putting it, it's a construction.
This is the construct.
So in other words, according to Musser, it makes sense in a world that is an illusion or a construction, but that sounds familiar. Wait, that sounds like the sort of world Morgue was talking about before.
This shows that reality is non-local, which means distance is an illusion.
No, reality is local, and that's why distance is a thing. Systems can only interact with, become entangled with, their immediate surroundings.
Well, sorry, Martymer, but I'm afraid most of the physicists here agree with Morgue on this one. You just heard Musser say it, and he's not the only one. It's consensus now in the quantum gravity community that entanglement reaches underneath and outside of spacetime. And you can either have Morgue say it,
which means distance is an illusion.
or you can have Brian Greene say it.
I seem real enough, don't I?
Well, yes. But surprising new clues are emerging that everything, you and I and even space itself, may actually be a kind of hologram.
Or you can have Leonard Susskind say it.
Is the three-dimensional world an illusion in the same sense that a hologram is an illusion? Perhaps. I'm inclined to think yes, that the three-dimensional world is a kind of illusion.
Or you can have Fotini Markopoulou say it.
What we're seeing is that the whole notion of space and time is probably not really fundamental.
But it's the same fact of science either way. It doesn't suddenly become science when Leonard Susskind says it, but switches back to being pseudoscience when Morgue says it. I mean, that would just be silly. And at the Big Bang, it's all immediate surroundings, so this doesn't help us to distinguish what a particle can and cannot be entangled with insofar as distance is concerned. So appeals to immediate surroundings are not going to help you.
In a sense, you're right that distance is an illusion, in that space is not the fundamental thing we're used to thinking of it as, but rather something that emerges from quantum entanglement.
Say what?
Say what?
Say what?
Say what?
Say
what?
What did you say?
In a sense, you're right that distance is an illusion, in that space is not the fundamental thing we're used to thinking of it as, but rather something that emerges from quantum entanglement.
Say again.
In a sense, you're right that distance is an illusion, in that space is not the fundamental thing we're used to thinking of it as, but rather something that emerges from quantum entanglement. But this in no way makes reality non-local.
Yeah, it kind of does. In fact, it makes it completely non-local, or more precisely, extra-local, because this ultimate level of reality beneath space doesn't even have locations then. Furthermore, there is no sense in talking about glitches anymore, because you just ceded Morgue's main point. If neither space nor location exists at the fundamental level of reality, then what we're calling space and locations are actually illusory constructions of this more fundamental level of reality, which was the whole point of Morgue's video in the first place. So congratulations. I'm glad you agree with him now about physical reality being an illusion. Oh, and look at this. This illusion that we are calling physical reality? Well, it looks like it's based on code.
The future, at least of this development, will be that we start actually with information. So information is going to be our starting point. And space-time is not something that we start with. We forget about what space is and what time. And then somehow the information, by thinking about how much information is, what information is doing, then the space-time will, what we call, be emergent. It will come out of just a bunch of zeros and ones.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that sounds like code. Well, what do you know about that? Well, it looks like you've just ceded his main point.
We're going to show right now that these glitches, these paradoxes, are only strange when you view reality as being material and being physical.
No, they're not.
Wow, look at that. It's like you have complete amnesia. Either that or some serious cognitive dissonance. You just got done agreeing with Morgue that space, aka what we call physical reality, is an emergent construct, or what we would describe in more simple terms as an illusion. And now you're going back to acting like it can all be explained materially. I suppose this would be through the material, non-material explanation you just gave about space emerging from entanglement. I'm not sure how that can count as a material explanation while at the same time being an immaterial one. Maybe it's a quantum superposition or something. Who knows? But anyway, let's continue.
The first thing that you have to understand is that this reality isn't a simulation, like a video game. It's not something that aliens programmed or something like that. This is a mathematical reality.
This already hurts.
What's wrong, Martymer? Have you never heard of Max Tegmark and the mathematical universe before? I mean, Morgue's idea, be it true or false, is already mainstream enough.
Reality is a mathematical reality of mind.
Of course. He's gonna go full idealist.
You are acting like that's any crazier than what you already just admitted to about space being an illusion. Listen, the supposedly crazy thing about idealism is that it says that physical reality is an illusion. But guess what? Physics already jumped that shark. And furthermore, it has been jumping that shark every 2 seconds in the last decade of research. So what? Idealism, though quote-unquote crazy, isn't any crazier than where the physics already is anyway. In fact, the only difference between the two is that idealism postulates a mental substrate for the illusion, which is not crazy at all given that we already ruled out a material substrate at the beginning of the video. Furthermore, if you look up Giulio Tononi's papers on the integrated information theory of consciousness, you will find, lo and behold, that quantum entanglement counts as integrated information and therefore consciousness. Now, where else have we heard of quantum entanglement before?
Space is not the fundamental thing we're used to thinking of it as, but rather something that emerges from quantum entanglement.
But you know what that means, right?
Ooh, ruh-roh. Ruh-roh. Ruh-roh.
Meaning, if you also adopt integrated information theory, which a great many cognitive science researchers do, then you should also be admitting that your admission before means that space-time emerges from consciousness. But that would make you an idealist, wouldn't it? Furthermore, I should point out that a basic understanding of the Kantian phenomenon-noumenon problem demonstrates that science isn't even a possibility unless idealism is true. For science to be possible, you need to be able to logically proceed from your mental perceptions to the external world beyond them called the noumenon. Except the rules of logic tell us that we can't get unlike terms from unlike terms. So if the outside world is at all logically connected to our mental perceptions, then it must come in the same ontically mental terms as our mental perceptions. And if it doesn't, well then you are trapped in hard solipsism and can't study the outside world with your senses at all. So why shoot yourself in the foot, Martymer, if you can't even justify science without idealism?
Look, okay. Mind is not a substance.
No, that's just idiotic and incoherent to boot. Saying that the mind is not a substance negates everything we know about the mind from philosophy of mind and introspection. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you can throw out neuroscience either, and we will get to that momentarily. However, it is to say that if you are to explain mind, you can't dismiss one entire half of the evidence. The proper explanation for consciousness needs to fit both the direct evidence of introspection and the neuroscience, or it simply is not an explanation for consciousness. Period. Now, the mind can't be anything but a substance, because only a substance can be conceived of in isolation to anything else. Actions, such as brain processes, cannot be conceived of in isolation from brains, unlike minds, which you can still conceive of in a state of complete Cartesian skepticism. Thus, brain processes are not minds, even if they correlate to minds. To equate the two is to commit the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy.
A mind is the product of a brain.
That's not false, but the question is how?
That's why chemicals and physical trauma to the brain can affect the mind.
Correct, such as the differing lithium isotopes in rat brains. Except they shouldn't be doing that because, as you know, isotopes only differ by the number of neutrons they carry, and not any chemical properties. Except, oddly enough, they do anyway.
So what this experiment did is it took something like 24 female rats, divided them into 4 groups. Lithium-6 to one group in that drinking water, lithium-7, naturally occurring lithium, which is essentially lithium-7, and the control rats for 10 days. Then they impregnated these 24 female rats, undoped males. I don't think it's important, but and during the 20-day gestation period, as the pups grew inside, they continued to feed them lithium-6, lithium-7, and the control rats. They gave birth to the pups, and what they were looking at and reported in this table is the mothering behavior of the rats. And they were looking at things like nest building, nursing, grooming of pups, retrieval of pups when you take the pups away, how much do the mothers grab the pups back, grooming of self, reaching for food, state of alertness, and so forth. Now, the control rats were average in everything. It's kind of amazing, huh? Are you suspicious? Is this blind, double blind, triple blind, or not blind at all? I don't know. It was done at the Cornell University Medical School, so, but let's look at the naturally occurring lithium, which is essentially lithium-7 and the 99% lithium-7. So nest building absent. Well, that means something. Nursing infrequent, short duration. Grooming of pups infrequent. Retrieval of pups infrequent. Grooming of self absent. State of alertness low. Okay, well, so that's consistent with my own experience and experience of others that have taken lithium. If you take high doses, you are less alert. There's no question about it. So maybe this makes sense. Well, what about lithium-6? Okay, so lithium-6 is normally 8%, but these rats were given, the lithium-6 rats, 95% lithium-6. And the results were just too unbelievable for me to believe. Nest building was excessive. Well, they built a lot of nests. Nursing was very frequent and long duration. Retrieval of pups, I like this, excessive. Well, you know, these were helicopter rats. You know, what can you say? These were the safe pups, though. Okay, the one that really caught my attention was a state of alertness very high.
And if it's not chemical properties at work in the brain correlating to mind changes, it must be quantum ones. But recent research in quantum biology demonstrates that's quite plausible.
Feed lithium-6 to some rats, lithium-7 to some rats, have some control rats, and look for any differences in behavior. Are there any behavioral manifestations which might be present? It seemed like a completely crazy idea. How could there possibly be? Because the chemistry should basically be identical. The chemistry is determined by the number of electrons. Lithium-6 and lithium-7 have the same number of electrons, of course. How on earth could this possibly be that the two isotopes of lithium have an opposite effect on the sign of the mood of these female rats? Well, okay, there's a mass ratio of 7 to 6, not so big. But what's remarkable is the nuclear spin entanglement time. I showed you this 10 seconds. Well, it turns out that's for lithium-7. Lithium-6 is 5 minutes. I don't know about you, but my memory is not much longer than 5 minutes. And when I saw that, I was like, good Lord, could it really be that evolution had, undergone the process where nuclear spins, became qubits in a quantum processing in the brain, and that our brains are some sort of quantum computer?
But now if our minds are entangled quantum states across our brains, then that would fit with Danoni's definition of consciousness before, as well as the notion of space-time emerging from some larger consciousness in a physics-based model of idealism. So now you know how the mind can be both a substance and nevertheless correlated to the brain. And that doesn't require you to adopt any patent idiocy, such as calling the mind a process or other such nonsense.
Everything just randomly springing from nothing. That's insane. What it was mind being transformed into matter.
Because that's not insane?
No, Martymer, that's not insane. At least not any more so than the point you already conceded earlier.
If all of this is some kind of informational process running in some machine, the machine is not in this universe. It's somewhere else, and this universe is a consequence of its running. And so that's just a bizarre kind of fact, but it solves one very difficult problem, the cosmogony problem, which is how did the universe get started? And I've never seen anything more harebrained than the ideas that came up with the Big Bang starting as some kind of quantum mechanical, just nothing turning into something.
That explains nothing. How was there a mind in a point too small to contain a brain, which is necessary to produce a mind?
No, it's not necessary to produce one. It's just necessary to house and provide the internal connections for one. It's perfectly conceivable, though, for those entanglements to be housed in something other than Posner molecules in the brain, such as, for example, entanglement networks beneath spacetime.
How does mind produce matter?
Oh, that's the easiest of all. It just simulates it.
So a particle will follow a wave trajectory because it is following a mental trajectory.
Oh, wow.
What's the matter, Martymer? You're acting like you've never heard of Kaufman's conscious realism or the entire field of quantum cognition before, where wave functions are treated as distinctly mental items. This is all perfectly plausible within the ideas already out there, as opposed to, of course, what you think the mind is.
The mind doesn't occupy space because it's not an object, it's an activity.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
And this is, of course, complete lunacy. What you just said is not even a coherent concept. It's like Stephen Colbert saying, I am America, and so can you. When we refer to a mind, we are referring to an I, or a Cartesian ego, that can be conceived of in isolation to literally everything else. But you can't conceive of processes without something to process them. Furthermore, Searle's Chinese room has shot this notion to hell even more. Processes are only syntactic arrangements, lacking semantic content in and of themselves, such as minds possess.
It's just like you can't say that a football game occupies any space. The field does, the players do, the ball does. But the game itself is an abstract concept. It's an activity.
Yeah, I will just have to keep that in mind then. If you choose to respond, I will need to remember that I'm not actually talking with Martymer, as Martymer is not real, but is an abstract object and an activity, rather than an actual being. Or perhaps you just prefer to be labeled a P-zombie. Now, if Morgue or any of his Hyperions are watching this, I have something he very much needs to see. It's something rather explosive. Of course, I can't be absolutely certain, but based on his other videos, I'm about 99.99% certain that he'll be very, very interested to see this. So if you are a Hyperion watching this, make sure he gets this message, and make sure he contacts me. I can be found on Facebook with the same name and images on my channel, and I can upgrade his physics a bit. But secondly, let's just say I also happen to have been hiding a proverbial nuclear device in my basement, and I would be very eager to show him how to detonate it. I can't say much about it here, except to say that it would bring everything he's been saying related to this sort of esoteric metaphysics and physics stuff up to the next level. So Morgue, once you get this message, find me on Facebook and link me up. Well, have a good one.
Hey, what about Major Kong?
If you like this video, subscribe and support me on Patreon. And don't forget to check out the books in my Alaris novel series, Alaris, The Lances of Light, and Alaris, The Pearl of Heaven, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. You can find us on Facebook as well, at Idealism and Science versus Atheism.